Martin Bell, first time you've been in this newsroom?
Yes, it is. Indeed it is.
What are your first impressions?
I think I'm in a state of shock and awe. It reminds me of a sort of battery hen factory with electronic add-ons, but I'm sure it's going to produce some wonderful news. What matters is the people, really, but not the machinery.
What, as an outsider, how do you think BBC News has evolved in that time?
It's taken the road of rolling news, which puts the journalists under huge pressure to be first and fastest, rather than to be the best and the most accurate. And it chains them to these bloody dishes in faraway locations. You know, there's what you quite believe it's called a dish monkey, is the guy who has to answer all these questions from this central hub over there. And I think what's happened, technically it's brilliant. What you're lacking is authenticity, the sense of actually being there.
Now, you go right back, you first joined the BBC in 1962, right back to the days of film, which needed laborious processing, and if you were doing a foreign story, it took a couple of days to fly it back and so on. I mean, that must have been immensely frustrating.
Yeah, but I went all the way back to Alexandra Palace, which was the museum and birthplace of television news, and that was also very exciting. Yes, you're right, it was film. We glued strips of film together. The editing process was very slow and laborious, and the pace of the pieces was extremely slow. Everything changed in the early 80s with the arrival of the handheld electronic camera. And the marvellous thing about that was you didn't know how to process it, you could edit it in the field. So people like myself, we had this wonderful sense of freedom. An 11 a.m. ceasefire deadline came and went, and the fighting after it was, if anything, fiercer than it was before. We could be thousands of miles from this sort of editorial hub that you see here. And we had to be trusted. And one of the editors of what was then the 9 o'clock news did gently chide me once. He said he'd like to know what I was up to. And I said, but as I was being shot at and he wasn't, he'd let it go. And once the editor of the day asked me, well, what's your report about? I said, it's about 1 minute and 42 seconds. You can't get away with that anymore, can you?
Today's editors, of course, would say that the reporter on the ground often sees only one part of the picture. He or she sees it very vividly, but it is only part of it.
That is true, and I think there's a huge responsibility on the reporter on the ground to be accurate and not hype the story and not faff around with the soundtracks. We know the kind of thing that can happen.
So here's our brand new television studio with automatic cameras going round on sort of railway tracks. Very different from the old days at Television Centre.
At Alexandra Palace we had automatic cameras in 1965. There was a marvellous sense of adventure. I mean, we used to get things wrong, I'm sure. But you'll understand the culture of the place when I tell you that the bar was twice the size of the studio.
One of the things, of course, that happens in these studios a lot is correspondence either in the studio or out there by satellite doing two ways with the presenters. Now that's something that was just coming in when you left in 97, and I would suspect you would think was the moment at which television news started to become rather less satisfactory.
I wasn't best pleased with it, because what they were essentially, you've done your package, you've been out there all day, putting the best pictures and the most accurate pictures you could. Then essentially you were quizzed by somebody and let's say it all over again without pictures, shall we? And I call it being well Trevored after the great Trevor McDonald, because ITN got there first. And the answer of the hapless correspondent would always begin well Trevor. You know? We followed them.
And of course by that stage we had mobile phones, so almost wherever you were in the world you were in contact with the news desk.
I'm always suspicious of old folk who talk about a golden age of this or that, but there was a kind of a golden age. It started with the arrival of the electronic camera in the early 1980s, and it ended when the mobile phone arrived in the front line. You'd answered it and you'd be told what the feeling of the meeting was. I didn't care about the feeling of the meeting. And of course, television reporting at about this time became a performing art. You know, you had style coaches. I was never taught to talk and walk and wave my arms at the same time.
But I've seen you doing pieces to camera in the old days. Don't tell me you weren't performing.
I was criticised for being ramrod straight and not moving about.
Looking around at all this extraordinary technology, is there anything you envy about today's television news environment?
I think I envy the immediacy. When I tell you that the reports I did from Vietnam, they would be put in parcels and loaded onto an aircraft, and they'd reach London 4 or 5 days later. So it was always film has just reached us from. All of that changed in the early 80s. That's what I miss is the pioneering spirit. But what I envy are the technical possibilities that you guys have today. But what matters is the people. I'm sure you got the right people.